Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Beyer. I'm with GAI Insights, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live event. Today, we're going to be talking about, share my screen here. We're going to be talking about 12 items to consider when deciding between open and proprietary large language models. It's something we've been hearing a lot about, certainly in the press, and we've been getting a lot of different questions like this from companies we're working with. Goals today, two main ones. Make sure you leave with a clear understanding of the issues to consider and the trade-offs, and obviously get your questions answered. We've got people online here, and I got a few of the people that may text me. And we're going to go through definitions and the 12 issues. You'll see how they are interconnected, and very specific recommendation at the end. A little bit about GAI Insights. We're an analyst firm here based in Boston. And really have been deep into Gen AI from the beginning of this year. We have still do the largest chat GPT meetup group in the United States. We were cranked out 15 use case videos back in March. Talking to a lot of companies here. We had a fantastic conference in September where we had 20 enterprise case studies and 300 people. And our WINS framework was recently published in the Harvard Business Review. And that's been a great useful tool for helping executives and teams think through urgency and prioritization of projects. Two fantastic presenters today on our team, Tim Andrews and Julio Barros. Both are longtime executives and technologists, and delighted that they are joining us today, and you'll hear more from them as we go. Julio, you want to start us off?
Sure. Yes. So today we're going to talk about the issues you should consider when you're trying to decide to deploy an open source model or a proprietary model. And by open source, we mean a couple of these different models. There are many of them out there. BERT is one of the older ones. Bloom is I forget who made it. I think it came from France. But there are also some other new ones that have been doing really well, like Falcon and Llama 2, Mistral, and Zephyr. And then by proprietary, we mean the ones that you can't get the weights to or that you access through an API primarily. And those are like the most famous one, of course, is the GPT models from OpenAI. There's GPT 3.5 and GPT-4, but there's also Claude and Cohere, and Google has a suite of them. AWS has announced a bunch of them, and Microsoft has a bunch also that fall into the proprietary category. Yeah. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the types of use cases so that we all have like a common base understanding of what they are. We're all used to chat and talking to the chat GPT through the web interface, but the next thing that maybe some businesses and some people try to do is to do chat with my documents, which is also sometimes called RAG, for retrieval augmented generation, where you have a system and you upload a bunch of documents and you try to ask questions. You ask questions and you try to answer them from documents themselves. But there are more use cases, and more I'm seeing different kinds of workflow enhancement things where you have a bunch of documents and you're trying to use an LLM to extract information from them. A lot of these are, let's say you have forms or invoices or something that have a free-form text field, and you want to be able to extract information and ask questions about the field, about the information in those fields. Or you have something that's more data transformation, which is kind of a similar task, but maybe you also have a bunch of invoices and you want to be able to extract the addresses or the amounts and then create a JSON record so that you can process it more easily down the road. So there's a bunch of different like ETL style applications that I see people trying to do now.
And, excuse me, Julio, I'll ask a few questions as we go.
Sure.
Are you seeing, is it 90% number one and 10 and 10 and 5, or is it all over the board? Or
I think it's all over the board, and it's hard to say what the percentages are. I think people and organizations are at different points in their journey, and so as they first start trying to understand what generative AI is, they might be exposed to the browser, and then maybe the next thing that they think of is doing a RAG application, so you can search through your documents really easily, or have customer service kind of self-service with your documentation or even internal documents. And then once a company starts getting really experienced with this, they start thinking of all kinds of different things that they could do. A lot of it, what I've seen is, like I said, ETL or document processing. A lot of people get invoices, they get onboarding forms from either customers or patients. They get a lot of like doctor's notes, things like that they need to analyze. And I'm breaking it down. I'm kind of ignoring the handwriting to text kind of part of it. Even if somebody types it in, you still need to be able to analyze the text.
Yeah.
I think that's mostly right. I would
Mhm.
say there are some concentrations. Software development, I would say, actually is number one right
Sure.
now, both because the group is technically oriented to start with,
Absolutely.
and because it's incredibly helpful right away. And
Yes.
not just code generation, but setting up environments, getting the right libraries, all the minutia that has to go on to make an application actually work. That is a big one. And companies are starting to graduate further in that one, I think, than elsewhere, and that they're also now starting to say, okay, to the second one here of RAG implementation, I'm going to put all of my code, because I have a repository typically that already has all of my code. And then I can have it analyze my existing code and also potentially enforce policy compliance in my code. So I think that is the number one most widespread use right now in what I would call real work beyond people just trying things out to see what this stuff is. And then I think I agree largely with what Julio said after that. I think internal facing, staff facing applications and functions like HR, whether it's employee documentation like acceptable use policies or things like that, or job postings where you have to generate some text. Those are very popular. And then customer service, where you have agents or you want to provide self-service to large amounts of documentation on your products and services. Those are very popular as well.
Absolutely. I totally agree that the coding is probably the most popular thing. I also think that there's more applications to come, especially when we're thinking about multimodal models. I have seen prototypes of people feeding images to a vision model on a regular basis, and then having the vision model kind of analyze what's in the image, either for security reasons or just for narration reasons or for traffic flow in an area, where you could say that we have 3 people in here now, we have 4 people, we have 5 people, we have no people, things like that. And I think people will come up with all kinds of interesting ideas to use these kinds of models in a variety of ways beyond chat and RAG. Okay. Next. I just wanted to talk what it means to deploy something. Probably the easiest thing is to use a vendor through a vendor model through an API. So that would mean hitting the GPT-4 or GPT-3 through an API and using that service. There's also the ability to use an open source model and some proprietary models through your existing platform provider, your existing VPS, virtual private network, your own cloud. And I think all the major 3 vendors, AWS, Google through Vertex, and then Microsoft through Azure, offers proprietary models, and they also offer the open source models through there. So you can access them that way also. There's also open source models, and the standard ones, you can just use Llama 2, or maybe you could use a fine-tuned version of Llama 2, or you can probably create your own model too, and then have it hosted on vendor hardware. That would be having it hosted on those 3 big providers. Plus, there's a slew of other providers that are selling GPU time that you could put a model on there and have it run for you. So it doesn't have to be your hardware specifically. You can also open source. You can also run your own models, and these would probably be open source models or models you've created on premises. So I mean, on your hardware in your office or in your data center or wherever it is that you want to host it. There's just a lot of different ways you can host these models. And then now there are even, there's always been models on the edge, which traditionally means devices like phones or tablets or computers out in the field. But it can also mean CDNs are starting to offer models now too, so that you could have Llama 8, you can hit a Llama 8 model that, Llama 2 model that's hosted by Cloudflare, so that it's very, very close to your customer, wherever that customer is. So that's a kind of a combination between edge and the hosted on vendor hardware. All right. Some things you might want to consider when you start looking at these things is, well, why would you be interested in open source or proprietary models, and what's the difference? One characteristics you need to consider is the model performance, and we kind of think of model performance in two different ways. One is like response quality, whether it's getting you answers that are good or good enough for your particular application, and the other is the kind of resource requirements. And the biggest one there is latency. In general, a bigger model will give you a better quality response, everything else being equal. I mean, everything else is never equal, but if it was, a bigger model will give you a better response. But it would be slower to generate the answer. And if you're talking about proprietary models, then you don't have less control over the queuing and the batching and where you are for it in the queue to get a response back from them. So,
and I think Julio, if I can jump in for half a second.
Mm-hmm.
So we're doing this because we want, in a compressed amount of time, to really get into the details here of what these models are about. But we're going to say this a number of times, and I'm going to say it first right now. This assumes that you have a good idea to pursue. This assumes that you have a use case. This assumes that you've thought about ROI. Mm-hmm. So that's really critical here, because as Julio pointed out, addressing these issues like performance is very dependent upon what use case you're in. And so there is plenty of room for experimentation. If you're really just trying to figure this stuff out, that's fine. But if you're starting to get into weighing these various parameters and trade-offs because you have an actual application, you want to make sure you've really thought hard about what the use case is and drive the requirements from the use case.
Julio, I've got a couple questions where people didn't want to post with their name on LinkedIn. So let me at least read one I think is relevant here. Is to you as well as Tim, but we'll start with Julio. Is which one has less hallucinations, open source or proprietary?
Oh, I don't know that I can answer
that. I don't think anybody knows a good answer to that. This is part of the challenge with new markets is, I'm old enough to remember when relational databases first came out, and we had a simpler but similar problem. And how did you really measure if a relational database was faster than another relational database, or if a relational database was faster than the older databases that were around, codicil databases and other things prior to relational? And it's very difficult because, again, it's very context dependent. And so you have similar problems here, where if you have a very narrow domain and you do lots of processing of the input, the prompts, and the output that you get from the LLM, you might get a fairly low level of hallucination. But really aren't great evaluation tools yet.
So it sounds like the answer is there's not a specific answer. It depends. It's another one, depends.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Then that's an area of a lot of research, but there's no clear answer right now. Another aspect that you might need to consider is security and privacy. All of the vendors will give you some kind of enterprise and security guarantees. So you send your data to them anyway if you're using S3 or Google Docs or anything like that. But if you have some very stringent privacy requirements, first of all, you might need to wait to set up for legal to analyze the risk and to get the contract signed and all that. So that might take a little while to get that going. Or it just may not be possible, or you may be decided that risk is not really one you want to take on for the particular project you're working on. So if you host a model, an open source model, and you host it on-prem, the security and privacy kind of requirements might be a little bit more agreeable or easier to work with. Another thing you might want to consider is integration. Is it flexible and is it compatible with what you're trying to do? are the libraries there? Is it easy to access? Another aspect would be scalability. You would normally think that the bigger vendors can scale, but it also depends. They can scale in throughput. They probably have the most hardware, more hardware than you would have. But it also depends on if you're talking about latency. Sometimes you want to make sure that you can process a certain number of requests in a certain amount of time. And if you happen to be doing things on the edge anyway, you probably scaling takes on a different flavor because you're going to run on somebody's phone and they're kind of bringing the hardware. So scaling is a different issue.
And about integration, we should say a couple of things. First, and one of the first things we generally advise people, again, it's general, so specific cases may be different, but first look to your existing cloud provider. If you are already a Microsoft shop, an Azure shop, or you're already an AWS shop, that's going to make your life, your integration life, a lot simpler in general. So you want to take that into consideration. The other thing is, if you're using large application suites, so SAP, NetSuite, Oracle Financials, Workday, on down the line, all of these vendors are adding large language model capabilities directly into their products. So that's another thing to consider in terms of integration. So you have to think about integration more broadly in terms of your existing infrastructure.
Yes.
Hilary, there's one question on the a comment from Michael on the comments about third-party tools on performance, such as Galileo's large language model studio. Are you familiar with that, or have you seen any tools that have been impressing you, or Tim?
I have not. I'm not familiar with Galileo. No, I'm not.
Okay.
No.
Great.
Okay. All right. Updates and improvements. In general, if you have somebody else hosting your application for you, they're responsible for the updates, and that's great because you don't need to worry about it. They're responsible for any improvements. Again, that's great because you don't need to worry about it. The one got you with this is you need to be careful with. You might need to be careful with having upgrades or changes or improvements that you didn't know about or you didn't plan on, because it might result in different responses or different quality of responses for your application. So this actually might be a win or a plus for open source models, because if you control that model and you control those weights and you control that hardware, I won't say reproducible because these are all stochastic or probabilistic models, but you can then replicate that environment at any time, and it's up to you to change it when you go to change it. And
Hilary, make sure I understand that. So when I use like a ChatGPT, they're doing whatever they want to upgrade that like a traditional SaaS model. So I'm forced to take whatever it is, and if I take 500 or 100 prompts in January, test them with the current, they feel good in January. As the calendar year goes forward, OpenAI may decide to make some changes that potentially would influence, and I may or may not know about them, or may not see them in the release notes.
Right, exactly. And they label their models like you would use ChatGPT for 0613 from June 13th, or 1106 from this month or whatever. So theoretically, that means that the model itself is not changing, but they may have to change something around the model themselves, including like guardrails and what they allow and they don't allow. I don't know that that is included in those release notes. So if you are trying to generate, so recently, they are making it, they're a little bit more aware of copyrights kind of issues. And so when you ask for something, if you ask for something related to Disney or a Disney character or a copyrighted character, it might actually change the prompt and give you something else, more for a guardrail or a security kind of thing. You may not be trying to do anything with copyrighted material, but that might be a prompt that worked for you before that works differently now for you. And these things will may change underneath, may change without you really knowing what's going on. And even less, probably less of an issue. I believe that even changes in hardware can give you like slightly different answers at times. So if somebody upgrades their hardware, they may not say that, may not tell you that that's a new model, but it might perform differently, especially if it's kind of deployed in a slightly different way. So all these little things might be issues for you in the future.
Yep. And they're subject to, remember, the training, particularly about something, one of these large models like an OpenAI or a Cohere or an Anthropic, there are several layers to the training. So there's the basic training, what we might call, then they do fine tuning of their own, and then they often do human reinforcement, what's called reinforcement learning with humans.
Yeah.
And that's specifically to attempt to mitigate bias and harmful text generation and things. Those things are semantic, and they can overlap with your prompts and results. So that's where it gets complicated, because they may quote unquote improve the model by preventing certain kinds of harmful output. But in so doing, because they aren't exactly just saying don't do this phrase, right? They're changing weights and parameters in the model. They may impact what you're doing, even though what you're doing is not harmful and has nothing to do with that. There can be overlap just because of the structure of the language.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And on the flip side of that, you may want to update more frequently for whatever reason. You may want to fine tune your model monthly for some reason, and you may or may not be able to do that with a proprietary model, but you're certainly free to do that with an open source model or your own model. The next few factors are pretty related, but we'll say licensing. That just means be aware of the licensing. I believe there are actually like three different licenses that are important here. One is the model architecture itself, and that's usually fine in open source. Somebody says, I have this Llama 2 architecture. It has so many transformers. It has so many trainable parameters in it, and this is the input it takes, this is the output it generates, and that's fine. But that's like the hardware level. That's like the architecture level. You can also have the model was also trained and generated a bunch of weights. So the weights can come under a different set of licenses, and so you want to make sure that you have the right to use the license in whatever application it is you're trying to use. And then with the open source models in particular, companies, well, actually for both models, companies, it's still unclear how much or what kind of attention they should have been paying to the data that is used to train these things. So even if somebody says that you have rights to the architecture and you have rights to the weights they created, they may have trained on data that they didn't actually have rights to. And so that means that you don't actually have those rights to that data. And so then the question is all still legally murky as to whether you should be using those weights or not, or what the situation is there. So the licensing issue is something that you should be aware of, and you should consult with your counsel and figure out what it is you want to what you want to do in each case.
That's right. And again, as of today, all of the large vendors will indemnify you against that particular liability of unlicensed IP in the training data. You'll want your legal counsel to review it to make sure they're comfortable with it, but Amazon, Google, Microsoft will all indemnify you against that particular liability, not against the others, but against that particular liability.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
And just to keep it precision, on the text side, correct?
On the chat side, Microsoft, at least, if you use OpenAI's chat interface through Azure, so you connect through Azure and you use the OpenAI chat interface, they will indemnify you. If you use the API to call them OpenAI API, they will not indemnify you.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah. So, and then that brings up the next point, which is the liability risk. So I was thinking that this is slightly different than the licensing, but it's very, very related. Everything is kind of tied together. Somebody might license you something, but then not indemnify you for how you use it, kind of thing. But there are liability risks, even if you have access to the data or license to the data. You want to make sure that data is unbiased and is fair and meets whatever your ethical requirements are there also. So,
right. And this is easy to trip over. There's a lot of work going on. So again, we're not trying to be negative Nancy's here. We believe in these products and they have a ton of value. just trying to open your eyes to make sure that you're aware of these issues. There's a famous example of Amazon actually wanting to improve their recruiting using these kinds of models. And so they of course, Amazon is, I think, the largest employer. Maybe Walmart is slightly larger, but they have, a couple of million employees at this point. So lots and lots of data to feed in about their interviewing process and their job descriptions. But it turned out, particularly in the technical side, that they mostly hired males. And so the bias was there. It was incredibly biased towards favoring males because that was the training data. So inadvertent, they didn't intend it to work that way, but they ended up not using it because they realized that their sample was incredibly biased.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to speak up for Amazon a little bit, I think they were trying very hard to make it not biased, and they and to their credit, they shut it down as soon as they found it. And the thing was that the system was able to find not gender directly from names and things like that are obvious, but gender balances or biases based on the universities that they went to, that the applicant went to. And the system was able to figure out that some universities were primarily women, attendees, and that caused the bias. All right. So that's the liability and the risk, the intellectual property concerns, same type of thing. Make sure that the major vendors are indemnifying you for some IP issues. Make sure you understand what they are going on. Ability of talent,
excuse me, Julia, excuse me for interrupting. This question on the IP stuff is does it matter? Do I own the output of a closed or open model? Is the question.
I don't know how to answer that. I think I think that maybe Tim knows better. I think that OpenAI has said that you own the output of the models that they create, and there's nobody in the open source model to claim ownership of the open source output. So I don't know.
I think there is ongoing question. OpenAI, in some of their licensing, does claim some. Again, you're going to have your IP and your lawyers sort this out. Does claim some ownership. OpenAI, by the way, will indemnify you the same way that Microsoft and others will. But in terms of if I generate an image or a video or text, do I own that output? That's less clear in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's not clear to me at all. Okay, so the other is the ability and the availability of talent. And this is up to your organization and whether you have people that can or are interested in fine-tuning models, whether you want to use, the screen changed, Paul.
Yeah, I'm just trying to give a little variety for the audience.
Oh, okay.
That's
Director Paul.
Whether you prefer to do, if you need to do fine-tuning or anything like that, whether you prefer to go with like a vendor solution where they're trying to make that as simple as and as easy as possible, or whether you're willing to take on a little bit more technical challenge there, and then what's available there. With the open source models, there might be more people that are familiar with them, but the proprietary models, you might have other specialists there that do really well or that know those platforms really well too. So it's hard to say, but you need to figure out what your talent pool is like.
And Julio, it's talent all around, right? It's not just a large language model. It's the LangChain. It's the.
Sure. Yeah. I think if you're going to use LangChain, you could probably, it doesn't matter which one it is, but maybe the prompt engineering, if somebody is really good at coaxing information out of one kind of model, they may not be as experienced with another model. Right. But yeah, it is all around.
Right. And this is where early winners, for lack of a better term, have a tremendous advantage because the development community ecosystem becomes much stronger, and it's one of those tipping point or self-reinforcing phenomena if they can get there. So right now, OpenAI is in the pole position, and there's a lot more people with knowledge of the OpenAI system and the OpenAI APIs and other things than there are for many of the others right now.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's what their whole dev day was about at the beginning of last month,
Yeah.
was to try to get as many developers into that camp as possible, as quickly as possible, to keep them away from other people, from other platforms.
And
Yep.
Julio and Tim, we have about 10 minutes left, so just gonna give me a time
Okay.
check.
Okay. Ease of implementation is whether the model is flexible, whether it's customizable. Can you train it from scratch? Can you do some fine tuning? You can train a smaller model from scratch, and if all you need to do is do like text classification or text segment or sentiment classification, you could totally on specific kind of, you can use an existing model. If you had a particular slightly different or a particular use case that was different enough, you could train a BERT model pretty easily. That's not unreasonable. So you could do that with an open source model, but you can train other the proprietary models. You can fine tune them. You can fine tune many of them, but you can actually do anything you want with the open source models. And then the 11th is cost, which is an important one, but it's such a complicated one. We kind of left it here because we wanted to introduce a lot of the other concepts. It's like, it depends on what kind of performance you want, what kind of latency you're willing to deal with, what kind of hosting services you want to deal with, and all that. It really goes into the cost. A lot of times it's part of the build versus buy thing. Buy is usually cheaper, at least to start with, and then build can be cheaper in the long run if you plan on using things at really high volumes.
And we talked about this, Julio, earlier today. If you are doing prototyping, if you're initial efforts, it's also much faster in general to buy. And so we would encourage you to use a cloud-based platform to start with. Even if you know you're going to need higher performance or other things, the cost is going to be low enough at that level.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
you do want to think about it, and we do these kind of spreadsheets with AWS services or Azure services all the time. If you're going to scale, to think about what the cost of scaling is really going to be, because that can have a big influence on the cost.
Absolutely. And that goes into support and maintenance and what your support team looks like, and whether they can take on another machine to manage, or if you just want to use something else. So with all that in mind, let's talk about some use cases that we kind of hinted at before. If you just have a chatbot with regular HR onboarding, and you just want to get your documents into a system so you can ask your questions, or you have a point of concept, a proof of concept for a board or for directors or something like that, you'd certainly want to buy. And you can go through vendors, you can go through OpenAI, you might want to choose to do a GPT, one of their new GPTs, which is the easiest way to do a kind of a RAG system. There are RAG vendors out there. That's really a great way to go. Individual employee use within a company. The company guidelines usually are not super proprietary. So again, you can use a third-party vendor. It's no problem getting that data somewhere else. It's not going to be a really high volume use type of thing. So the easiest, fastest, cheapest way is probably to go that way. Then we start going into things where maybe you have more security concerns, like maybe you need to review insurance claims or medical intake forms, and you don't, or you can't post that information to another service, or you have such a high number of them that the volume goes up or the latency becomes important. So that might be one where you start trying to think about bringing in a model into your system, either through your own private cloud or through your own on-premises hardware.
Excuse me, I got one question, another email question, Julio.
Sure.
This one on the employee one. This person said, I've been told that employees should always, for employee use, you should always use Llama 2 behind the firewall. Do you agree with that statement?
I don't know that you can say anything should always be done. It's always going to depend on the situation.
Yeah, I agree. There's no standard answer here.
Yeah, I can see the concern if you're saying your employees are going to put sensitive information into the ChatGPT window, because that is by default, they can keep that and they can use that information to train, and they're going to learn from that information. But if you have either the enterprise account or what you're doing is building your own application to hit the API, then those privacy concerns are very different and not as concerning. So I would bring that up with your management and try to figure out exactly what you want to do and what risks or what's acceptable there. but I wouldn't
we
say.
had a number of conversations with large enterprises, and none of them are using Llama 2 behind the firewall as their primary employee access at the moment. Generally speaking, they're going through Azure and doing a deal with Azure, where Azure is saying, we will make sure your data is secure and we will make sure none of it gets passed to OpenAI.
Right. And if you're doing something like drug discovery or financial investment kind of analysis or something, and you need that stuff done fairly quickly, or you have a lot of data that you need to process, and you're willing to buy a cluster or buy a hardware to do that and bring that in-house, then that would certainly be a situation where a fine-tuned or custom-trained model in-house totally makes sense.
Right.
That's not the case.
Large amount of data, sensitive data. So I think also healthcare systems for epidemiology and things like that are going to be very interested in this,
Sure.
because the data is very sensitive and there's lots of it.
Sure. Yes. And then the last case was on-device use in the field. If you have a lot of employees or representatives out in the field, either, I don't know, delivering packages or inspecting buildings or something, and you want to add LLM capabilities to that, you might choose to do at least some of it on device and with a custom model or with an open source model, and then maybe some of it, depending on connectivity and everything, some of it could be brought up to the cloud. That's
complex product repair.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Another one.
All those things, yes. So in summary, we think you got to keep your business goals and your use cases in mind because that's going to drive everything. You can start your experiments and your proof of concepts with a proprietary model. That's the easiest, fastest way. It's a good, powerful model. So it'll tell you whether you're on the right track and what you need to do. And then you can move to an open source model if you have very specific requirements around security or performance or costs or costs. That's it.
So it feels like Tim and Julio, part of it is that it depends. There's not a black and white answer question.
Absolutely.
Is that the right headline? Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because there are very many different use cases, and they're all very different, or they can be very different. And this is all super early.
Right. And we're going to see different architectures apply. So for instance, because the cloud, the way it's currently architected, except for the case, which I think will become more important, of edge devices. But for the moment, the cloud is really architected like old mainframes. Everything goes up to the cloud. Everything is processed there. So so the thing that I think will happen pretty quickly is batch processing. So if you have, Julio's example of, I've got a lot of forms coming in that I want to extract unstructured information from, well, that might be really expensive if I'm making live real-time API calls, but I wouldn't be surprised if the large vendors start to say, okay, well, send us a big batch of them, and we will bulk process them at a much lower rate, much lower cost.
Absolutely. And that's a use case where either a large vendor can do that or one of the smaller vendors where you, instead of paying by the token, you pay by the hour. So you get like a huge cluster for an hour, and you do all your batch processing there. And that's
Yeah. But it is very much
fabulous presentation, Julio. Yeah, Julio and Tim, fabulous presentation. I want to wrap up. We've got two other things upcoming. We have a great. We get a lot of questions on what's going on with Microsoft. They have so many different offerings. Andy Roberts from Microsoft will be on a similar webinar next Thursday. And we recently published our corporate buyer's guide to large language models. So Tim and Julio, thank you. Thanks everyone that will help you and your team, everyone.
Thank you.